Okay, my wife says she is watching YouTube chat for me as well. Um, I'm getting used to all this stuff. It's just stuff. You know, I was never trained to be a televangelist. This is like totally new territory. So,
That's
oh,
totally new for me too.
Pam's on here. Yeah, we're all just learning new skills, right? And
Yep.
I had a discussion today with Len Sweet, author and my teacher, and a lot of you from Northminster have met him and heard him. Um, he was sort of discussing like how weird things are and how things may never go back to normal. You know, how do you, after going to the store, not going to the store, or going with a mask, ever go back the same way again? Or I went in today, I had my mask on at Walmart. They're only letting a certain number of people in, so you can only filter in one door. And then I'm there 2 minutes and I hear somebody yell from partway across the store, "It's 6 feet!" And I believe there was an expletive that I won't repeat on YouTube that followed that. And like, how do you go to Walmart the same way ever again? I mean, how do you shake hands with strangers ever again? It's just weird. And so we were reflecting as a bunch of pastors about what that means for the church in the future. Like when we can get back together, will everybody come back, or will they move to online? And will together be the same anymore? I think my professor thinks a lot of the people who do come back to church are going to be ones that are really committed and miss the community. So it could be a deepening of community at the same time, sort of a widening and this is, I think, going to train churches to be churches more than 1 hour a week. You know what I mean? So I think it's
Right.
gonna go both ways. Okay, I think we've got who we've got for now. So let me. Somebody else called in here. But let me pray, and we'll jump into Bible study. Lord, as we are entering Holy Week, in a very different kind of Holy Week, just bless us, care for us in this time, meet us in a special way, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, it is Holy Week. Hopefully, you got to catch up on the sermon from for yesterday. I sort of did this whole thing on the life of Jesus and a little more in depth on Holy Week, and kind of stopped right at the resurrection because that'll be next week's sermon. And last week in Bible study, we went through Holy Week into Maundy Thursday, so we're going to pick that back up. Wanted to say too, I posted a couple of devotionals for Holy Week. One written by my friend Kevin Young. He's a pastor down in Florida. I think it's really good. So make sure you check that out. Kind of a devotional to take you through Holy Week. Another one that a friend of Abby's sent, that's really good for families. So if you want to walk through Holy Week, both of those ways I think are good ways to do it. I'm going to jump in. Anybody has questions? Just jump in with those. That'd be fine. Sound good to everybody? Okay, so last week we talked a little bit about Holy Week, Palm Sunday coming in, picking a fight with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the religious leaders of the day, the high priests, and that. And I said when he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, he knows what's happening. Jesus has clearly, in all four Gospels, been sort of picking this fight, heading towards this fight, and predicting what's going to happen. And when he's at the Garden of Gethsemane, he could get away. Okay, he could get away. He could easily leave, go up over into Bethany, and then around that same mountain, he's in the Judean wilderness, which he has spent time in, which he has traveled in. He spent 40 days there early in his ministry. He can get away. He chooses not to run from what he knows is coming. So he's in this Garden of Gethsemane, which is at the bottom of the Mount of Olives. And I talked about this last time, that you would never, Gethsemane means like an olive press. And you would never press your olives at the top of the mountain, because then everybody'd have to walk to the top of the mountain with the olives. You'd always bring them to the bottom to press them. And the bottom here is actually closer to closer to the city of Jerusalem. So that's what you would have wanted. So he takes them to the Garden of Gethsemane. He liked to pray there. It was on his way in and out of the city from Bethany. So he traveled through there quite a bit. He's still sort of teaching. He has some anxiety and sweats drops of blood. That is a real medical condition. I don't have the name of it in front of me. It's a big, long name, but you can look it up. The idea of sweating drops of blood. It normally relates very much to anxiety. That you and your anxiety, you're so worried that you start to sweat, and bloodlets gets into the edge of your skin, so has that. The disciples can't stay awake, but they're tired. It's been a busy week. Judas knows where he's going to be because he has spent a lot of time in this garden. So Judas takes some soldiers. We're not told how many soldiers, but he takes some kind of guard of soldiers and heads to the garden to betray Jesus, and betrays him with a kiss. He could easily just point to somebody, right? Like there's been a lot of discussion about Judas, particularly since the movie Jesus Christ Superstar came out. I don't know if anybody. I like to watch Jesus movies for Holy Week. It's one of the things I do, and I really like watching that one. But that one was one of the first ones to portray Judas as more of a good guy. Judas sort of trying to force Jesus' hand. But that's really clearly not what's going on in the gospel. John in particular says that Judas was stealing money, that he would help himself to the funds of the group, and to betray with a kiss. And there's no sense of him trying to force Jesus' hand, force him to be the Messiah everybody wants him to be. There's just no sense of that. It's a betrayal. And to betray with a kiss is to show love and extend hate. And that, so I've never quite understood those who have tried to argue that Judas was in any way a good guy. I just don't think it adds up with the story. But it's a fairly popular view. Well, part of that story too is Jesus is not going to be the kind of Messiah that everybody wants him to be, right? That's the whole incident with Peter and the sword. He takes out the sword to cut off the guy's ear, and he's going to defend Jesus, but Jesus is not going to be that kind of Messiah. He's not going to be that kind of authority. And a lot of people really wanted him to be. Of course, this is the paradoxical nature of Jesus, that Jesus is going to be the one who suffers, who wins by losing, okay, who defeats by being defeated. There's a certain sense of irony of, there's a certain paradox to Jesus always, but in his death, most seen. All right, questions, comments so far? I'm trying to. Anybody? Going once, going twice. Nobody wants to be on YouTube. That's the problem. Okay. So Jesus is arrested at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is taken to 3 religious trials throughout the night. One before Annas, one before Caiaphas, and one before the Sanhedrin. The location of these, we're not quite sure. Probably The first two both happen at the house of Caiaphas. And archaeologically, we think we know where Caiaphas's house is. Some of the people on this call have been there. Caiaphas, as the chief priest, had a prison in his basement. And prison was part of his job was to enforce religious law, Jewish law. Now, the one thing they couldn't do was to execute someone. That right was reserved just for Roman law. So they could abuse someone, they could throw them in prison, they could fine people, but they could not kill anyone, couldn't execute anyone. But the escalation in trials shows the first of all, they have nothing to hold against Jesus, other than blasphemy. And blasphemy wasn't something that you could be crucified for. The only thing they could get him crucified for was the fact that he said he was the king. Any kind of claim to kingship, Romans paid attention to that. So then what they would probably do is probably question Jesus and then put him back down in the dungeon in the prison cells and then bring him back up and do some more questioning, and back and forth they go. And if you read the Gospels, you can get hints of what those conversations were like. Well, how did the disciples know what the conversations were like? Well, one thing, Peter followed and was in the courtyard until he denied Jesus. A girl, some kind of servant girl, finds out he's a follower of Jesus because of his Galilean accent. He doesn't sound like the upper class Jews that lived where all the priests lived. So Peter may have heard more about the trial there, but we also know of Joseph of Arimathea. We know of some of those other characters that might have been in on some of those conversations to be able to say sort of what happened there. Okay, so that's Thursday evening. Friday morning, Jesus has 3 civic trials. Pilate, and then Pilate sends him to Herod. Now, Pilate is Pontius Pilate is the ruler of Judea. This Herod is not Herod the Great. Herod the Great of Jesus's birth story has long since died. This is one of Herod's sons, and this Herod is in charge of Galilee. Okay, he's the authority for Galilee. So Pilate is like, I can't deal with this guy. I want to keep the priests happy, but I don't think I should kill this guy. Oh, you're from Galilee. I'm going to send you to Herod. Herod then won't do anything about it, doesn't want to get involved in the politics, and he's not going to send anyone to the cross in Jerusalem. That's Pilate's job. So he stays out of it, sends him back to Pilate. Now, the big question is where these trials take place, because the current setting of the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering that's marked where Jesus may have walked to the cross, assumes that Pilate is staying in the Antonia Fortress, which is this fortress next to the temple. It's more likely that he was staying in Herod's palace. That gets confusing because you would say, why isn't Herod staying in Herod's palace? Well, they're different Herods. Okay, we're talking about the palace that Herod made, which is in Jerusalem today, was about where the David's Citadel is, right by Jaffa Gate. So where, if you were on, some of you on the Israel trip, we would walk in that gate all the time. So Herod was probably, or Pilate was probably there, and Herod was probably staying in a mansion that was built by some of his family members. The Hasmoneans had a palace there, and so depending on kind of where they were is the start of that. And then once Jesus is arrested or once Jesus is sentenced to death and goes to the cross, then the question becomes, where is the end of the Via Dolorosa? History tends to be with what's called Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but some argue for another place called the Garden Tomb. And so the Via Dolorosa is academically much contested. Actually, not that much academically contested. Academics seem to think that Pilate was almost certainly at Herod's palace where the citadel is, That so the start of the Via Dolorosa is wrong, but almost all scholars I read say Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the place where the cross, where he died and was buried. All right, questions, comments?
Interested.
What's that? All right, you guys are not giving me a lot of comments, but that's okay. We will keep going. All right. So the Via Dolorosa, if you look this up, I wanted this year to have Stations of the Cross. In fact, I bought pictures to have the Stations of the Cross that you could walk around the sanctuary and do, but did not work this year. But if you do those sometimes, or if you have done them or were raised Catholic, there's 14 Stations of the Cross, 15 if you add the resurrection, that take Jesus from station 1 being condemned to 14 being laid in the tomb. Some of them are traditional. Jesus meets his mother. Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. We don't know how many times he fell. So some of it's just tradition, comes out of the Middle Ages, really, as just a way of celebrating Easter. And for some reason, Protestants at the Reformation leave it behind, but I think it's actually a nice journey to go on for Easter. And so you might think about looking that up for your celebration here. Along the way, Jesus is he's got a number of beatings. He's whipped with a cat of 9 tails. A crown of thorns is put on his head, and thorns over there are not like rose thorns. They're these big sort of nail thorns. I have some somewhere, and I meant to find them, and I didn't. So there you go. But so there's these big things, fairly thin but very hard, and so to even weave those into a crown would have been difficult, and then to jam it into his head would have been into his head. He's forced to carry his cross. Jesus probably doesn't carry the whole cross. He probably carries the cross beam. I mean, he would have been so exhausted. I don't know that he could have carried a whole cross. But, we have this image of the whole cross. First of all, we have this image of the cross being really tall. The cross doesn't have to be tall. A short cross is much more efficient. Okay, it's much easier to put up. And at that point, height doesn't matter. On the cross, you die of suffocation. Okay, you get to the point where you're so exhausted that you cannot open up your ribs to open up your diaphragm to breathe anymore. So crucifixion actually doesn't even always have a cross. Sometimes crucifixion is just a pole. Sometimes it's impaling. So in your mind, think short cross. And in all likelihood, it may have been a capital T. We're used to a small t. In some ways, a capital T makes more sense because then somebody could carry out their cross. 2 soldiers could stand on stones or something and then put the top beam up, and that way the person is just much more efficient. The only archaeological evidence that we have of an actual crucifixion, because wood doesn't stick around. And we have pictures and carvings and descriptions, but they found archaeologically a leg bone that had been of somebody who had been crucified, and the nail was still in the ankle bone, because if you look this up, the nail bent, so they couldn't get it back out. So they had to just bury the guy with the nail still in. What's interesting about it is his foot is, I don't know how to describe this well or on video here, is along the side of the cross. Okay? In other words, his feet are separated and then nailed this way through the ankle bone into the side of the cross. Artists in the Middle Ages kind of put a little footstool there for Jesus, right, to push up on and to be nailed to. We have no evidence of that archaeologically. Again, the only evidence we have is actually of this sideways, sideways nailing. From the cross, a number of things happen in the story. Jesus gets a drink. A centurion confesses his faith. He is crucified by two robbers, and they're close enough that even with shortness of breath, they can talk to each other. So you got to imagine short crosses, close together, probably pretty low to the ground because people wanted to be able to yell and spit and I won't describe too much, but if this was a murderer who had murdered a family member, you wanted to be able to let that person know that they shouldn't have done that. That's why you were crucified on a main road too. Okay, it was right outside of the city gate, so everyone in and out would have seen this. The Romans were very good at crucifixion, so they could speed it up or they could slow it down. One of the ways they could speed up your death is to break your legs. If your legs are broken, then you can't stand up anymore to open up. Eventually your arms, think about hanging like this, right? Eventually your arms get so tired that you can't use your arms anymore to lift up your lungs to breathe. You'd have to push up with your legs. So every breath would be this effort to pull up and to, okay? And if they broke your legs, that would be done, and you would die very quickly. They did not do that to Jesus because he had been through so much already. He was already past. If you read the gospel stories, the veil in the temple is torn. There's an earthquake that opens tombs of nearby, and many rise from the dead. Jesus speaks 7 times from the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Right? That's to the thief on the cross. Jesus said to his mother, woman, this is your son. And to the disciple, that would be John, this is your mother. So he's taking care of his mom, right? Hooking her up with John to take care of her. My God, why have you forsaken me? I thirst. It is finished. And Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It's a little hard to put all these together because different gospels use different ones. Like, it is finished what he says last, or Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Like, which one came first, which one came second? It's hard to get those out of it is finished is in John. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit is in Luke. So it's kind of different. Okay, questions so far? Any questions? I could have just recorded this. Is this making sense to everybody? I'm sorry it's gruesome. It just is gruesome. If you've watched The Passion of the Christ that Mel Gibson put together, so hard to watch, it's probably tamer than the real event. For example, one of the things nobody, in none of the movies and in very few paintings does it capture the reality that this all happened naked. We tend to put a loincloth or something on Jesus, little boxers or something. In reality, this was naked. This was just utter...
It's utter humiliation.
Humiliation, that's right. That's the word I was trying to come up with. Yeah. Go ahead, Charlie. What's up?
It just seems strange, that they were probably good at breaking legs and stuff, but I think what they wanted to try to do is keep his body as whole, so that the religious people probably wanted to keep his body as whole.
Well, hold on, because there is. I'm going to get to that in a second, because there's a prophecy about his bones. All right, so Jesus multiple times in his words from the cross, he is quoting the Psalms. So you can go back and look at these last words. They call them the last words of Jesus. And if you look them up in the Psalms, what you find is Jesus is actually doing some pretty interesting stuff. Um, and the other interesting piece of that, just by the way, is that most of the Psalms that Jesus quotes were actually hymns that you sang. So we tend to think of Jesus saying these words, but in reality, he may have, and I think he did sing from the cross. Okay, it'd be like somebody writing down, and then he said, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." Right, and we would all just assume he kept going. Right, we would assume Jesus may have been singing. Raspy as his voice may have been, as dry as his throat was, as out of air he was, imagine him starting to sing. Now, Psalm 22 starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" So Psalm 22 is the big one. By the way, Psalm 22 is typically the psalm read on Good Friday. Psalm 23, that most people know, the Good Shepherd, is normally read on Holy Saturday, and then Psalm 24 is typically read on Easter Sunday. So if you watch the worship service for this week, the call to worship is going to be Psalm 24. But fascinating to read those psalms as Friday, Saturday, Sunday of Holy Week. But let me start reading Psalm 22. If you have a Bible, you may want to pull it up on your phone or in a book. This is 31 verses, but I'm going to read them because you got to understand when you read this, it's amazing what Jesus is doing here. Okay? My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. And you, our fathers, trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued, and in you they trusted and were not put to shame. So, first part of the psalm looks back at the history of Israel and says, God, you're look at how you've saved. Look at how you are holy. Look at how people have trusted you. Okay? And Jesus is in this moment actually being a part of that saving action. But now let's keep going. Verse 6, but I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. Now, we already know Jesus has been taunted. People would punch him and say, they blindfolded him, punched him and said, predict, prophet, who punched you? Okay, so all these people are wagging their heads at him. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. Okay? So that's the taunting. Yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. So here's this psalm that Jesus is quoting. But in some ways, is Jesus looking back to the Christmas story now? Is he looking back at his stuff? All right, hold. I'm trying to see who. Okay. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, and there is none to help. Many bulls encompass me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me, like a ravening and roaring lion. Okay, so Jesus is in the middle of this as people are yelling at him. The priests are judging him and wagging their fingers and their heads at him. Now this gets crazy. Everybody ready? I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax; it is melted within my breast. Now, that's amazing because Jesus' joints are probably out by now. Okay, what's going to happen as you hang like this? Your shoulders and your elbows are going to dislocate. I mean, eventually you're going to be hanging and you just can't hold anymore. Okay? And his heart is like wax. A lot of doctors who have read the gospel accounts think Jesus probably dies of some kind of an aneurysm or something on the heart. Remember, he's stabbed with a spear, and what comes out? Water and blood, right? Water and then blood. Well, theologically, we've always said that's the sacraments of communion and baptism, the water and the blood, and you'll hear that in some of our hymns. But what probably happens is if something bursts in his heart from all that pressure, imagine the trauma that his body's gone through, the whipping, the beating. Okay, if he had some kind of a burst in his heart, then what would naturally happen is fluid would surround that part of the body to keep the blood there. So the water and blood makes a lot of sense in terms of, so literally Jesus has something burst in his heart. Figuratively, he dies of a broken heart, is what that really may say. But here it is in the psalm. My heart is like wax, it is melted within my breast. Okay? My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of the earth. So remember, one of the things that we've already seen from Jesus on the cross is he thirsts. He says he thirsts. And here it is in the psalm, my tongue sticks to my jaws. For dogs encompass me, a company of evildoers encircles me. And here's the line that's crazy to me. They have pierced my hands and feet. There it is, right there in the psalm that Jesus quotes. They have pierced my hands and my feet. And then what's the next line? I can count all my bones. Okay? I have no broken bones. They're all fine. Okay? What's the next line? This is crazy. This is another one. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. That was in the story. Okay? They cast lots for his garment. But you, O Lord, do not be far off. O you, my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. You have rescued me from the horns of wild oxen. I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify and stand in awe, all you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried. From you comes my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will perform before those who fear him. All right, I'm going to stop there, but important to note here in this psalm that it starts with a feeling of forsakenness, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? That is not actually where the psalm ends up. Could that be an interesting sort of understanding? Okay. My wife is telling me that I have a message. So after all of this, is Jesus may feel forsaken because of our sin, but I don't think he's saying that he is forsaken, because if you read the psalm ends with, Lord, you have not forsaken me. All right, so Jeff left a message and said, how long did Jesus suffer before he died? So if you track the time, he's crucified about 9 a.m. And he dies about 3. He dies at 3 p.m. Now they don't have a timer, so that's not exact, but it's about 6 hours. But remember that since probably 1 a.m, he had been beaten and abused and all of that. This is well before that. I mean, he was beaten with a cat of 9 tails, so that's it's a pretty short whip, but it would have pieces of glass and stone and nails and stuff in it, and you it wasn't like a whip that you would do fast. It's a whip you would lay in, and then it would stick, and you would sort of peel back. So I don't. So how do you count that? He was crucified for about 6 hours, and was dead. They didn't have to break his bones before that. And like I said, probably from a broken heart, something wrong with his heart, and really that whip may have bruised his heart. You think about a piece of metal, piece of stone in that whip hitting him in the back. Could have bruised his heart. That could have been the fall as he's carrying the cross or the cross beam could have bruised his heart. The History Channel did a really good document. It's brutal, but did a documentary on crucifixion. And if you message me, I can try to send you the link or find it online. I bought it at some point. But they did science experiments where they like put somebody up where they could sort of hang on and so they could measure heart rate and breath and oxygen level of somebody being crucified. The experiment lasts about 6 minutes because this pretty healthy college kid can't hold it. Can't have the experiment keep going. So it's just the word excruciating. The word excruciating actually has cross in it, right? So the word excruciating is inspired by crucifixion.
Jordan,
It's brutal. Go ahead, Charlie.
the other thing is, the other prisoners, they normally didn't torture before they got to the cross, correct? Before they crucified him?
It just depended. But most of what Jesus encountered, he got from the Jewish authority, which I don't know that the other prisoners would have. So I don't know that.
What I was saying was, most of the time when they crucified people, they didn't torture them beforehand.
Yeah, I don't think so. The other prisoners may have been in prison for a while, so they may not be in great shape, but but no, they had not had the night that Jesus had. He was taunted and beaten all this before he even sees Pilate. It sort of escalates and escalates.
Right. Their hatred for him just escalated all night long, and they just
Yeah.
beat him more or less to death by the time he even got to the cross.
Yeah. The Romans could make this last days. They were very good at making it last a long time and shortening it. Okay, they were like experts at it. It's pretty grotesque, really. But it was part of how they controlled the people. It was a political symbol. It's why not just any criminal went to the cross. You only went to the cross if you were truly an enemy of Rome. And if you read the Gospels, they can't make that case for Jesus. Okay, Jesus told people to pay taxes. Jesus was not an enemy of Rome the same way everybody else seemed to say. But so here's the tricky part. Then Jesus dies at 3 on a Friday. They're going to break his legs. Why would they break his legs to hurry it up? Why not just drag it out? Well, it was Shabbat. It was Sabbath. And in the Sabbath, during the Sabbath, you Sabbath started at sunset. So it starts on Friday night and goes to Saturday night. So the idea was you weren't supposed to work and you weren't supposed to travel. You were supposed to be home for Shabbat, home for Sabbath. So what they would typically do is try to be home by 5 or 6. So think about it. Jesus dies at 5, or Jesus dies at 3. They have to be home by 5 or 6. Well, what do you do with Jesus' body? And you're supposed to put the body in the ground or in a tomb that day. So there's this big dilemma. But to answer that, Joseph of Arimathea, who isn't Joseph one of the Sanhedrin, I think? Joseph of Arimathea, real nearby, has a fresh cut tomb for his family. What you would do, it seems like if you were poor, you just buried somebody. But if you had means, what you would do is you would get a cut tomb for your family. What they would do is they would wrap the body in cloth, not in toilet paper. That'd be really valuable right now. But in some kind of cloth with all kinds of spices on it, and then they would lay the body in the tomb on one of a number of beds, and depending on the time period, the tombs were sort of laid out differently. These were typically in gardens that were made from harvesting the limestone that they would build with. So for a lot of people, what they would do is they would, for a lot of these places, they would mine this limestone. You could cut into good shapes to make the temple, to make houses, to make all this stuff. And then once they got to where they were past the good limestone, they would make those places into gardens and then just leave tombs in some of the holes where they were able to cut stuff out. They would form tombs. And what you would do is you'd wrap this so that the body could decompose over a year, all the soft tissue, without smelling too bad. So that was why you had all these spices. And without having any kind of toxic fumes from decomposition. And then you'd go back a year, typically a year to a year and a half later, and then you would unwrap, and then you just basically have the bones, and that way you could put the bones into a smaller box. They call them ossuaries, and they were typically made for the person. They were made for the size of your leg, your femur, which is the longest bone of your body. So you can generally, if you see ossuaries, you can generally tell if it was a man, a woman, or a child based on the size of the ossuary, right? So for a child, we know if it's a small femur, then it had to have been a child that was buried there. And then those would go underneath the beds or on shelves. There were sort of different styles, but that was the idea. So Joseph of Arimathea has a tomb that's never been used in the garden near where the cross happened, somewhere on the outskirts of the city. You weren't allowed, Jewish custom was you weren't allowed to bury anybody in the city limits. So it had to be one of these places right outside the city. So Joseph of Arimathea gets permission to get the body. He takes care of it, wraps it, puts some spices on it, and puts it into the tomb. But he has to do it kind of quick. Like, think about that. If he dies at 3, he's got to go get the body from Pilate, got to come back, take the body down, wash it, clean it, wrap it, get it into the tomb and then get home before 5 or 6. Okay, so it's got to be quick. So the idea is that several of the women that follow Jesus are going to come back the next chance that they get to finish the burial. Now, when would that be? Well, Saturday night, Saturday at sunset. You okay?
Yep, you're a little out of focus.
Oh, Mandy wants to change the focus. I'm moving a little bit on YouTube, I guess. Okay, so they want to come back, but Shabbat breaks at sunset. So you're not going to be able to go to the tomb at sunset. So what they do is get some more spices at sunset once the Shabbat breaks. A lot of times, even to this day, at Shabbat, there's a big celebration. Okay, a Saturday night is really fun in Jerusalem because everybody's out, everybody's about, everybody's going to different places. So these women go and they get the spices, so that early in the morning they can come and they can finish preparing the body for permanent burial. Of course, when they get there, they get a surprise, right? You also find in the Gospels that the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, by the way, these groups all couldn't stand each other. A lot of these groups fought. About the only thing they ever agreed on was not liking Jesus, right? It's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That was very much how these groups really were. So they've heard Jesus talk about on the third day or of resurrection. And the Pharisees in particular believed in resurrection. The Sadducees did not. So what they didn't want is Jesus either to raise from the dead or more likely for his followers to steal the body and to say that he rose from the dead. And then they get this huge movement. The whole purpose of crucifixion, the whole purpose of all these trials was to stop this movement of Jesus. So they put a number of troops at the tomb. The tomb has some kind of a stone that rolls into place. Again, this limestone you really could shape. You could mold it. You can cut it. In fact, the craftsmen to this day, they mine a lot of that stone around Jerusalem, and they can still cut it fairly square or fairly to the shape they want right out of the wall. I mean, it doesn't have to be, they don't have to try to fix it. So that's where this sort of circle cover to the tombs was very possible. They could easily cut that to make it what they wanted and then be able to roll it into place. It would take a number of people to roll this big stone into place, but they could set that up. And being in a garden, which was likely previously a sort of quarry for limestone, they would have had the limestone. They would have had the tools to make what they wanted there. So that is where we leave Jesus. He is in the tomb on Friday, stays there on Saturday, and then on Sunday is Easter and the resurrection. So I'll take questions. I'll just say I would encourage you to read these stories for Holy Week. Read them through for yourself and see what you think of them, and read the different parts. I'd also read them in different Gospels. This is one of the places where the testimony is not all the same. The different Gospels have different. Like the Gospels don't totally agree on what women go to the tomb. In John, it's Mary Magdalene. In another of the Gospels, it's Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. And in another Gospel, it's Mary Magdalene, another Mary that's the mother of somebody, and then Salome, this other lady. So you get all this different testimony in the Gospels, and so it's a little hard to square sometimes. So it's kind of interesting to read them side by side and see what you think, and to parse out some of those differences. All right, I have covered about what I wanted to cover. So what questions, comments, what else do you guys want to talk about? Hi, Bill. Such a quiet crew. You're not as quiet when it's not technologically based here. Anybody else? Come on, Pam, Patty. What are you guys thinking about?
I just never realized how accurate the Psalms were to this. It's amazing. I mean, I know that he referenced, at least we've talked about that before, but I never read through as much and realized how accurate it actually was.
I know that one's crazy. Psalm 22. To think about Jesus, to imagine all the people that were there that knew that psalm, that kept singing it or humming it.
Yeah.
And then you can imagine them starting to look around at like, oh my goodness, this is what the psalm said. Yeah, and it'd be interesting to look up. I don't remember, I'm not sure I ever knew how old that psalm was. You know, the Psalms are written of different times and different periods and developed, kind of like our hymnal. So, but it really is neat if you read, knowing Holy Week, knowing Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and then Resurrection Sunday. Go back this weekend, read Psalm 22 on Friday, read Psalm 23 on Saturday, and then read Psalm 24 on Sunday. 23, everybody knows 23, but think about the valley of the shadow of death in light of Jesus being in the tomb. And then 24 is this victorious sort of king psalm, psalm of kingship. And it really is pretty fascinating to see the Psalms as part of your Holy Weekend.
It's just so surprising that we start the week with the kingship of, the entry into Jerusalem, and then those same people by the end of the week want him crucified. It's crazy.
Yeah. Now, I've talked about that in sermons and stuff before. I think we got to be careful assuming that it is the same people, right?
Okay, I can understand that.
But yes, the turn of the crowd is important, right? I don't want to overstate, but I don't want to understate either. There is a big difference between Sunday and Friday in the relationship to Jesus. And again, if you read the Gospels, particularly Luke, as he develops that Holy Week, Jesus is doing that on purpose. You know, he's picking fights. He is not doing what everybody wants him to. I think if he had picked a fight with Rome, I think people would have gotten behind it. But he started picking a fight with the priests. And the priests had so much sway. So there is something to how that week unfolds.
Well, the other thing you can look at, probably, Jordan, is the fact that they all thought he was going to come as a reigning king. Somebody was going to get them away from Rome. And then he comes in and defies the religious people and just starts throwing things in an uproar. Now they've got to do something about it.
Yeah. And just keep in mind, I was dealing with this last week too, keep in mind that it's Passover. It is the festival of freedom. It is the festival of being God's chosen people and coming out of slavery. Okay? So if you were going to riot, if you were going to lead a rebellion, this is the time. The city is swarming with people. Okay? The fact that Pilate and Herod are there with all of these troops, that every year they do a crucifixion at this time, just to remind everybody. And then Pilate has this big thing where he lets a prisoner go. Like, oh, look at the power we have, and look at the grace that we show you all. We'll give freedom to somebody for your Passover, right? So, this is actually the perfect cocktail for a rebellion, which is why the Romans are watching it so closely, which is why the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests can force Pilate the way they do. Right? Because if the priests are talking bad about Pilate, there's going to be a riot. And if there's a riot, who's going to have to answer for that riot? Pilate. And that is why Herod wants nothing to do with this Jesus guy. Right? I don't care if he's from Galilee. He's your problem. Okay? So there's all this political jostling that happens in part because it is... it's happening in part because it is Passover. Okay? There's lots of other times where this wouldn't have to happen the same way. But at Passover, it's a big deal. All right, I'm gonna I'm gonna stop the YouTube video, and I'll stay on if anybody wants to continue chatting on Zoom, or if you want to record saying Happy Easter, just on here, I can do it for you. Um, but um, but I'll sign off of there. Just one thing I found out. Somebody posted on Facebook that since the Sights and Sounds Theater in Lancaster can't be open to show the Jesus show for Easter, they are doing a live show. It's not live, but it's a live stream of it. You can watch through TBN, the Christian TV station, and I think you can do that online. You don't have to have a cable membership. I think you can. They're just letting anybody who wants to watch it watch it. I've always wanted to make that trip and go to a show, but I think Easter weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, somebody can check. I'll try to post in the church family and on the Northminster site. But I think that'll be a good show. I've heard such good things. Probably won't be the same on TV, but at least it'll be fun. Okay, let me stop the YouTube. Thanks, everybody, and I'll come back on Zoom in just a second.
Thank you, Jordan.